everybody's about ready. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So we are starting a brand new Sunday school series called Answering Atheism. This is a course on apologetics, on how to talk to people, specifically atheists. Hopefully this will be of some value, some benefit for you guys. I want to start this presentation by introducing you to the type of people, the type of things that some people will say that oftentimes we find very, very difficult to respond to. And the goal of this presentation is to be able to train us, to be able to respond to some of this. So I want to start by introducing you to some of these things that are said by atheists. Christopher Hitchens, who's one of the more famous atheists of our times, recently passed away. He said, violent, irrational, intolerant, allied to racism and tribalism and bigotry, invested in ignorance and hostile to free inquiry, contemptuous of women and coercive towards children, organized religion ought to have a great deal on its conscience. He wrote that it was never difficult to see that religion was the cause of hatred and conflict, and that its maintenance depended upon ignorance and superstition. He talks about how the foundational books of religion are transparent fables, and that it is a man-made imposition, that it has been the enemy of science and inquiry, that it has subsisted largely on lies and fears, and been the accomplice of ignorance and guilt, as well as of slavery, genocide, racism, and tyranny. Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous atheist alive today, he said the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully. He wrote in his foreword to another book by Dan Barker, Godless, he said, it isn't difficult to work out that religious fundamentalists are deluded, that people who think the entire universe began after the agricultural revolution, the people who believe literally that a snake, presumably in fluent Hebrew, beguiled into sin a man fashioned from clay and a woman grown from him as a cutting, people who find it self-evident that the origin myth that happened to dominate their own childhood trumps the thousands of alternative myths sprung up from all extremities of the world. It is one thing to know that these faith heads are wrong. My mistake has been naively to think I can remove their delusion simply by talking to them in quiet, sensible voice and laying out the evidence clear for all to see. It isn't as easy as that. Before we can talk to them, we must struggle to understand them, struggle to understand their seized minds and empathize. What is it really like to be so indoctrinated that you can honestly and sincerely believe obvious nonsense, believe it with every fiber of your being? He talks about how religion is a mental possession by religious delusion. He says that this guy who was Christian, became an atheist, knows deeply what it's like to be a wingnut, a faith head, a fully paid up nut job, and all singing, all gosculating religious fruit bat. Sam Harris, who's another atheist, he said, by merely being in touch with reality, that's what he thinks atheism is, a person who is in touch with reality appears shamefully out of touch with the fantasy life of his neighbors. That's the life that you're living, is a fantasy life. Sam Harris once said, if I could wave a magic wand and either get rid of rape or religion, I would not hesitate to get rid of religion. Now, you see this from coming off of people, and you're like, holy cow, like how in the world am I supposed to even begin to respond to that? And you'll see people in your life that have been, persuaded by people like this, that have been influenced by the atheist movement, the atheist subculture. And they'll start posting, memes like this. They'll say, yes, I'm an atheist. No, you don't get to question my morals. When you believe in a book as horribly immoral as the Bible, you don't even get the right to ask. Okay, your Bible is horribly immoral. This person had put up that some of the side effects of the childhood indoctrination of religion are anxiety, terror, lack of trust, immaturity, inability to make decisions, sexual hang-ups, inability to understand science, inability to determine fact from fiction. These are all the things that you get if you come to a church like this one, or a church like any church. This guy said there is no difference between being religious and being mentally disturbed. Someone posted, religion is a mental illness. And when you meet someone like that, and that kind of flood of criticism comes at you, a lot of times we don't even know where to start with it. How would you respond when someone says, oh, you only believe in the God you believe in because you were born in a country that's where people believe in, and that's how you were raised to believe it? They would say, well, if you're choking, would you rather me pray for you or perform CPR? See, your prayer is useless. They'll say, you're an atheist, not just me, the skeptic, but you're an atheist because you're an atheist to all the other religions in the world. You don't believe in their God, I just don't believe in yours. They said, I would believe in God if he just, appeared magically in front of me. They'll say there's no evidence for the existence of God. They'll say that the Bible is evil, that it teaches slavery. You'll say, hey, I want to introduce you to Jesus who changed my life. They say Jesus never even existed. You say Jesus is my Savior, that Jesus is the Son of God, died for my sins. Like, he didn't even die. He didn't even exist in the first place. And you're like, holy cow, this person doesn't even believe that Jesus existed in the first place? They'll say, oh yeah, you think you're so moral, where Adolf Hitler was a Christian. They'll say that America, the founding principles of America, are founded on atheism. You think that America is a Christian country, but really it was atheists that founded America. They'll say that the Bible teaches all these immoral things. It teaches that you should marry your rapist. If a woman gets raped, she has to marry her rapist. They'll say that the Bible tells you to murder and eat your children. They'll say that, you believe in talking snakes and donkeys. They'll say the Bible's a fairy tale book. It talks about unicorns and things like that. And when this just wave of criticism comes at you from people who, it's not just skeptics of the Bible, it's specifically atheists that make these types of arguments. You're like, I don't even know where to begin with that. And the goal of this Sunday school series is to equip us to be able to discuss these things. Richard Dawkins talks about Dan Barker, who was a pastor who ended up becoming an atheist. And he had sent out letters to everyone explaining how he became an atheist. And he said that in the responses that he got from them, no one offered any kind of reason why his beliefs were actually wrong. And so he would give these criticisms to people, but nobody would ever respond to them. Nobody would ever answer his critiques. And imagine if you're a person that's been exposed to this atheist subculture, you believe all of that stuff that I just ran through. And now you go and ask your church, and your church has no answers to any of those things. What is that going to do to you when you're exposed to this kind of subculture, and your church has no answers? And so this is not only an outreach to attempt to answer these questions for the atheists themselves, but it's also to equip you with a good understanding of what to believe and why we believe it. Because I think a lot of people sometimes don't fully see the importance of apologetics. And J. Warner Wallace, who wrote the book Cold Case Christianity, he had a great way of phrasing this. He said, the mere fact that anyone could offer a thoughtful, engaging defense of atheism seemed to shake the confidence of many believers who had been taking their faith for granted. And I think a lot of people take their faith for granted. But this is not a Sunday school series that answers every objection from every different person from every walk of life. But this is specifically talking about atheists, and specifically atheists. What the atheists, the things that atheists will say, the ways that they will interact with religion, with Christianity. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking specifically at how do I talk with an atheist, which is different than talking with people of other faiths, or talking with people of other denominations, or people who are just, unchurched. So what specifically is an atheist? Well, a theist is someone who believes there is a God or gods. Now, an atheist is a specific group of person that I'm trying to get at here. It's not just someone who doesn't go to church. Like, if you can talk to someone and say, and they'll say, oh, I'm not very religious, or I don't go to church. That's a certain type of person that you can witness to, talk to. You'll have a certain type of conversation with them. Then you'll have people that are agnostics. Agnostic, the word means literally to not know, and it's just that they don't know whether there's a God or not. So it's someone who doesn't know that there's a God, and generally speaking, people that identify themselves as agnostics would be pretty open to the idea, and usually are curious and interested. Now, an atheist is someone that believes that there is no God. The theist means you believe in God, a meaning the opposite. Now, the exact definition of atheist becomes a very, very hot issue when you're having a conversation with atheists. And the reason why it becomes a hot issue is because there's a debate over who has the burden of proof, whether I as the theist have the burden of proof to prove that God exists, or the atheist has the burden of proof to prove that God does not exist. And so an atheist, what they'll do is they'll try to define the word atheism specifically so that they don't have any burden of proof. Because it's a weird claim to say, I believe that there is no God, because you're affirming a negative. Generally speaking, when you have the burden of proof in an argument, if you're affirming something, you have the burden of proof. But if you don't believe something exists, you don't have the burden of proof. So it's kind of a weird, awkward statement. So an atheist will try to define atheism in certain ways. They'll say someone who believes that God doesn't exist, but then they'll say someone who doesn't believe that. So someone who believes that God doesn't exist is different than someone who doesn't believe that God exists. A very, very tiny, minute difference there. And they'll say there's someone who lacks a belief in the existence of God. So I'm not claiming whether there's a God or not. I'm just claiming I lack a belief in it. They'll say someone who rejects the claim that God exists, because then the claim is on you. The reason for this is that they're trying to define atheism so they don't have the burden of proof. And it's important to note this because atheists get very particular about how you define atheist. And so the important note that I would put on this is that I, as a Christian, am taking the burden of proof to prove that there is a God. We're going to do that in our second class to show the evidence for the existence of God. So atheists, when they're talking to me, I don't want them to get upset about how I would define a term. I don't want them to get pedantic about how to define the term atheist. And one of the things that I see a lot in the atheist community is getting very, very pedantic over terminology. Now, it's important to get your terminology right, but it's also important to not obsess over the details so much that you end up losing the point. And oftentimes, people who get pedantic focus on trivial aspects, and they usually do it to show off their knowledge. You're so stupid because you don't know the definition. It's like, I'll take whatever definition of atheism you want. I'm going to take the burden of proof to prove that there is a God. And a lot of times they'll try to redefine terms just to make it sound more reasonable. So Dan Barker, in his book, he defines agnosticism as the refusal to take as a fact any statement for which there is insufficient evidence. Well, by that definition, I'd be an agnostic. I don't want to believe something without proper evidence behind it. And he says they may possess strong opinions and even take tentative stances on fuzzy issues, but they will not claim as a fact something for which data is lacking or something which data contradicts. Agnosticism is sensible. It's like, well, by that definition, it's sensible. By that definition, you can call me an agnostic because I don't want to believe in something that doesn't have evidence to it. But that's not what that word agnostic means, okay? So don't call me that, because that's not what it means. An agnostic is someone who is unsure as to whether or not there is a God. And so there is a difference between an agnostic and an atheist, but the difference between an agnostic and an atheist is less about definitions and more about practicality. There was a Karl Marx's son-in-law. Karl Marx knew Charles Darwin. Karl Marx's son-in-law was writing about Darwin and called him an atheist. And Darwin had corrected him. He says, no, I'm not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. And Karl Marx's son-in-law replied back, and he said, atheism is only agnostic written aggressively, and agnostic is only atheist written politely. So sometimes it's more about the method in which they go about and the way in which they have the conversation that tends to define how they would identify themselves, whether they're an agnostic or an atheist. An agnostic, generally speaking, is a person who's interested in religious questions, generally positive towards religion and religious perspectives, and has yet to be convinced, and claims they don't have enough information to conclude if God exists or not. But generally speaking, they're a person that wants to listen, and that's an open door to have a conversation with people about, here's what I believe, here's why I believe it. An atheist is also very, very interested in religious questions, but extremely negative towards religion and religious perspectives, and has been convinced of the evils of religion and claims to have enough information to conclude there is no God, and they're an activist for this perspective. There's the difference between coming to you with a question and coming to you with a purpose. I have a worldview I want to convey to you, and I'm the same way. I have a worldview that I want to convey to you. And there's general trends of what makes an atheist. I've read from many, many atheists, and there's some general things that tend to be true among atheists. Again, when you generalize, a million people, you have to make some generalizations. But generally speaking, most atheists have a religious background, and that throws a lot of Christians off. Dan Barker, who wrote the book Godless, he was a evangelical pastor, who became an atheist. Okay, and a lot of times people get really thrown from that. Like, wait a minute, he was a Christian and then he became an atheist? Anthony Flew was a very, very famous atheist. He was basically the Richard Dawkins of his day, but eventually became a theist. Eventually gave up his atheism and became a theist. He wrote a book called There Is a God. He was raised religiously, like most atheists are. He says, I was raised in a Christian home and attended a private Christian school. In fact, I'm the son of a preacher. So normally atheists have a religious background. Normally the atheist's religious background was a very rigid background, which emphasized dogmatic beliefs and emphasized feelings over facts. And generally speaking, the word that people use for this, and I don't like this word, this is one of the problems you get to, is this word. The word that they'll usually describe Christians who are like this is fundamentalist. Now, depending on how you define fundamentalist, I am a fundamentalist. I believe in the fundamentals of Christianity. That should make me a fundamentalist. But generally speaking, fundamentalist is much less of a word with a definition than it is more of a slur that's oftentimes used. So they'll have certain implications behind that they're stupid, that they don't believe in evidence, that they are against science, that they are very dogmatic in their beliefs, and they don't really have any reason to hold those beliefs. But they have this, for lack of a better word, I'll use this word fundamentalist background. But again, depending on how you define that word, I could call myself a fundamentalist because I believe in the fundamentals of Christianity. But it's a certain background where they really didn't have any kind of grounding in, you should believe in the Bible because it's true. They were just told, believe it. They were just told, you have to believe it. Don't worry about whether it's true or not, just believe it. And it was more based on feelings than on facts. And Dan Barker's talks about in his book Godless about his background. And he talks constantly in his background about how it was an intense desire, a strong inner sensation, how he had feelings. It felt real. It was affirming to feel something that wonderful. He said, we sang those simple yet profound gospel harmonies that stir the soul. It was no surprise that I felt the call to continue to a life of ministry. He says, I was encouraged and appreciated. I felt like I was set apart for some special ministry. He says, I don't remember that we delved very deeply into the evidence or arguments for or against Christianity. He didn't have any background into the evidences for Christianity. And one of the things that happens with people when they seek out feelings, when their entire Christian experience is seeking out a feeling, is that they tend to be very wishy-washy and go from church to church to church, just searching for that feeling. He said, I could stick it out in a church for about 18 months before feeling the call to move on, because there was some new feeling that he had to chase. Christianity isn't about chasing good feelings. Sometimes there are bad things in life that happen. But he says, we were sincere. I indeed felt that I was talking with God and that Jesus was my Lord and friend. It was entirely about feelings. There was no concept of evidence that what the Bible said was true. There was no talk about anything like that. And because of that background, many of them felt intellectually unstimulated by their religious upbringing. Our mind is a part of us just like our soul and our feelings are, and we need to be intellectually satisfied. And they did not get that intellectual satisfaction from religion, from their fundamentalist upbringing, from their upbringing. And so they sought out information, and they'll usually just lump it all under the umbrella of science. That science gave them all the knowledge and wisdom that they wanted. And so Dan Barker talks about, I began to scratch this intellectual itch. I read some science magazines, some philosophy, psychology, and daily newspapers. He's reading all this stuff, and he's learning so much. And there was this great experience, because I couldn't learn anything. I couldn't read a book when I was a Christian. I could only read the Bible. But now that I wasn't a Christian, I could read other books. He says, I think it was at this point I made the leap, not to atheism, but to commitment to follow reason. And they think that, okay, I'm going to use my mind now. And because of this process, they end up rebelling against their religious upbringing. And normally, again, this is not always true. In Dan Barker's case, this is not true. But normally this happened later in their childhood, early in their adolescence. And I like to say, and this is kind of a sarcastic thing to say, but I think it's helpful. I kind of jokingly say that atheists are teenagers that have not gotten their questions answered. A lot of the things that atheists will say are questions that, I thought of when I was a kid, and I found good answers for them. And so I remained a theist. I remained a Christian. But a lot of those atheists didn't get those answers answered. And a lot of times this happens when they're a teenager. This happens as part of their rebellious phase against their parents. Anthony Flew said, by the time I reached my 15th birthday, I rejected the thesis that the universe was created by an all-good, all-powerful God. Christopher Hitchens says, I was nearly 13 and became quite the insufferable little intellectual. Dan Barker says that when he turned to all his religious friends of his, they would write back and they'd say, I don't have any answers. They'd say, it's not a matter of logic or intelligence. They say, you just have to continue to believe it. You don't look for answers. And that's, of course, not satisfying. Like, if you have a question, you should get an answer. And he says, of all the attempts to get me back in the fold, not a single one had any intellectual impact. And this is what kind of drove him to atheism. He said from the letters that he received back from his Christian friends, he said, none of them offered any defense of Bible contradictions. No one presented any documentary evidence from the first century or offered a single rational argument for the existence of God beyond the where did we come from garden variety. Most of the negative responses centered on things like humility, shame, attitude, prayer, in short, spiritual intimidation. He says, it didn't seem to them to realize that I was not seeking inner confirmation. I was seeking objective, external evidence. But one of the things that happens with most of these atheists is that they end up taking a lot of those fundamentalist beliefs and attitudes with them over to atheism. They have this 100% or 0% mentality. They go from Jesus is the Son of God all the way over to Jesus never existed. And there's no middle ground in a lot of these people. Again, this is not everybody, but a lot of these people. But they do it under the guise of intellectualism now. Now they're advocates for reason and science. Dan Barker talks about going to Iceland, and he says he wanted to climb up to a hill and say, I claim this land in the name of reason. And it's kind of silly, but it's not silly to believe in reason. We're all humans. We should be able to reason. But this idea that they'll take what are, quite frankly, really bizarre and strange ideas and things to say, but claim it's under the name of reason. But they do so because of their background, because of how they reacted to their background. They make radio shows like Free Thought Radio and write books about free thinkers, and things like that. The irony, of course, is that they don't believe in free will. Well, most of them don't believe in free will. But if you don't believe in free will, then you're not actually a free thinker. You're coming to the conclusions that the universe, that's just how you're reacting to the universe. You're not actually thinking freely. Just kind of an irony in the worldview. And there's also a lot of results from this atheism is that there's a strained family life. Either it is part of their rebelling against their parents, or it's caused by or causes it. Obviously, there's different examples of that. But a lot of times it strains family relationships because if you disagree on big things like, religion, that can cause a lot of family life. A lot of times they get sometimes if something happens to you when you're a teenager, when you're at a certain stage of development, you kind of get stuck there. And so a lot of atheists, like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, a lot of atheists act like teenagers because that's how they became atheists, as they became atheists when they were teenagers. And so they're very irreverent to people. They're not very respectful. Also leads to things like political liberalism, and the family's just looking and like, what in the world is going on with this person? Antony Flew talked about how he was confessing communist and became a left-wing socialist. Dan Barker talks about how Peter Singer is an atheist and he's the world's leading ethicist. And that the world's leading ethicist as an atheist is a feather in the cap of atheism. And if you don't know who Peter Singer is a philosopher who not only argues for abortion, but argues that you should be able to have infanticide, which is kill babies after they're born. And that's what the ethical thing to do is. And it's like, that's kind of a strange thing to call ethical, but I mean, that's a debate for another time, but that's a strange, it leads to political liberalism. And one of the things that Christians will do in response to this is, what do you do when someone is denying Christ? Well, what you do is you present the gospel. That's what Christians do. That's what we do. And most Christians, that's the initial response. But the atheist has heard this 1,000 times before. And it's like bullets off of Superman. It doesn't do anything. And you're like, what in the world's happening? Like, this is supposed to change their life. Dan Barker says that Jesus said that they that are whole have no need of a physician, but they that are sick. He says, we atheists consider ourselves whole, thank you. We are not sick. We don't need the doctor. And you're like, how in the world am I supposed to talk to this person? A lot of Christians are just kind of caught off guard, don't know how to respond to this. But the goal of this series is to answer the questions frequently posed by atheists. The goal of this is to take someone who has been exposed to the atheist subculture and all the things that they say, and basically either cure them, quote unquote cure them, being a little facetious there, to cure them of their atheism, but also to inoculate you from the atheist subculture. So I could just drop you in an atheist Facebook page and you wouldn't even, you wouldn't accept what they're saying because, I saw Jonathan's presentation and none of this is right. This is an outreach to atheists, number one. On my advertisement, my little flyer, I put there, BYOA, bring your own atheist. I want you guys to bring, if you know anybody who's an atheist, we'll have these as videos we can send to them. You can bring them here. They can have a personal conversation with me after class. I would love that. It would be an amazing outreach. But also it's to train Christians so that you can have these conversations yourself with them. Because a lot of atheists just don't know, like, it's okay to ask questions. That's perfectly fine. Carl Sagan had once talked about children and teaching children science. And he says, every now and then I'm lucky enough to teach a kindergarten or first grade class. Many of these children are naturally born scientists, although heavy on the wonder side and light on skepticism. They're curious, intellectually vigorous, proactive, and insightful questions bubble out of them. They exhibit enormous enthusiasm and ask follow-up questions. They've never heard the notion of a dumb question. Like kids kids are amazing to teach science to. And it's, I think, worthy of note that Jesus said that in order for us to get into the kingdom of heaven, that we need to have a faith like a child. Like a kid has no cynicism in them, but they just love asking questions. They love figuring out things. And that's what we can do. As part of my a build up to this, I had actually gone onto a bunch of atheist Facebook pages and asked them for book recommendations, and I got like their top book recommendations, and I've got to read a lot of them. I have a couple up here for you if you guys want to take a look at them. There were ones like Dan Barker's Godless on Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. The first place one that I was really surprised by, the most recommended atheist book from my kind of informal poll, was The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. And it was interesting because it's not apologetic for atheism. It's all about science and going against a superstition and things like that. But I think there's a reason why that's the number one, and we'll talk about that in our fifth class. But we're going to have 6 classes on this that I think will help get us at least most of the way there to where we need to be in terms of having to talk to atheists, and in terms of atheists themselves, if you want to bring an atheist that we can actually make some impact. This first class, we're going to talk about pop atheism, popular level atheism, the easy arguments that people throw around that are just kind of the top level. The first thing you say in an argument, they're very, very shallow. But we're just going to go through that and show how this is not clear thinking. And we'll also show some, not only arguments that atheists shouldn't use, but also some arguments that Christians shouldn't use. We'll talk about that as well. The most direct way of responding to an atheist is presenting the evidence for the existence of God. And so that's, other than today, the introduction, that's going to be the first thing we do, is we're going to talk about the evidence for the existence of God. But from my experience, atheism is not just lack of belief in the existence of God. Atheism is also, in practice, maybe not in definition, but in practice, it's a series, there's a bunch of things that they end up believing in that are just not true, just factually not true. And so there's a bunch of atheist myths. And so our third class is going to be debunking a lot of these atheist myths, that the Bible teaches slavery, that Adolf Hitler was a Christian, that Jesus never existed, that the Bible teaches a flat earth, that America's founding was secular. A lot of these myths that atheists tend to believe in, we'll talk about those myths. The biggest or the most common myths that atheists have are the ones about the Bible, and they'll say really strange things about the Bible. You're like, how in the world did you come to that conclusion after reading that passage? So we'll do basically an atheist Bible study will be our fourth class. Is all the things that atheists say about the Bible, maybe not all the things, but a lot of the things, and show how this is not accurate. Then we'll talk about, in our fifth class, 4 different attributes of atheism that I think stop atheists from thinking clearly about the topic of Christianity, religion, however you want to phrase it. And so I call these the real 4 horsemen of atheism. The 4 horsemen of atheism are Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. But I said the real 4 horsemen of atheism aren't, that's what they call themselves, by the way, which is a weird thing to call themselves. But I said they're not the four horsemen of atheism. The real 4 horsemen are these 4 attributes that I'm going to talk about. And the last class, we're going to talk about the problem of evil, which is considered their strongest case against religion. And I think that it's a perfect example of an atheist argument that showcases everything about the atheist, and we'll talk about that in our 6th class. But Stephen Hawking, who was an atheist, he said that heaven is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And John Lennox responded back to him. He says, atheism is a fairy tale for those afraid of the light. And I think that really kind of shows what my goal is here, is to shine just a little light in that darkness. But the first question we should ask is, should we even have these conversations? Especially when you're dealing with someone who's a little bit, not responding to you very well, not being the most polite. Should we have these conversations in the first place? Most people who have had conversations with people they disagree with will realize that they have not changed their mind at the end of the conversation. And most people will conclude that, having conversations with people you disagree with is worthless because they never changed their mind. And I think that that's a little misguided, okay? Because you shouldn't automatically change your mind just out of a 5-minute conversation, okay? And actually the Bible says that too. Paul says that we're not tossed by every wind of doctrine, that we're firmly anchored. I want to have a conversation with you to get you to think, but I want you to go and look into these things to see if they're true. You shouldn't just immediately change your mind after a 5-minute conversation with me. I like to use an analogy by one of our time's greatest philosophers, that being Jerry Seinfeld. And Jerry Seinfeld was talking to Elaine on the TV show Seinfeld. She was saying she was going to break up with her boyfriend. He says, no, you're not. And he says, breaking up with someone is like knocking over a Coke machine. You can't do it in one push. You got to rock it back and forth a little bit, and then it goes over. And that's really what having conversations with people you disagree with. If I have a conversation with someone, I got the chance to meet an atheist, and my brother-in-law, Daniel, he knew that I was meeting with him. He says, Josh is getting saved tonight. And I said, you know what, probably not. And I said, I want to be part of the rocking. I want to give him something that's going to move the needle a little bit and eventually get him closer. And maybe it's going to be 4 or 5 or 6 more Christians that he's going to have to meet in his life to finally change his mind. I'm fine that I don't get to reap the benefits. I just want to be part of that sowing. I want to be part of the rocking of the Coke machine. And there's a guy named Greg Kokel who did a book called Tactics, and he talks a lot about this. He talks about our job is to garden. Our job isn't just to immediately get everyone to be convinced of everything we believe in a 5-minute conversation. Our job is to just tidy up their brain a little bit. Let's get you to think a little bit clearer on this, give you a piece of information here, question you about this. C.S. Lewis, who's a famous Christian apologist, he once said, the very man who has argued you down will sometimes be found years later to have been influenced by what you said. Now, one of the things that we're not going to talk about in this series, because we've already talked about it before, is the topic of evolution. But one of the things that I will say, we did a Sunday school series here 2 years ago. We have four classes, 4 hours of breaking down the creation evolution debate. But I would say that you are going to end up talking to about evolution to an atheist. If you're talking to an atheist, it's going to come up. You need to understand this. my minute-long explanation of this topic is that the philosophy of modern science came out of Christianity. The university came out of the church, but in the 1800s, the university had become so separate from the church that they began to compete as rival centers of intellectual power in our society. The question is, does your professor have the answers, or does your pastor have the answers? And this is oftentimes called the war between science and religion, which I think is a misnomer. I think that's as silly as saying it's a war between math and history. It just doesn't make any sense. But it's really a culture war between the university and the church as to see who has the rivals, who has the real ability to answer people's questions. And so to compete with the church, the university had to make up its own origin myths. And a lot of these origin myths are the start of the divide between the church and the university. This including Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, uniformitarian geology, things like that. The university, in order to support these things, had to abandon its dedication to science in this war. And because the science fits with what the Bible says. I'm not going to prove this here. We talked about this 2 years ago. All my references are up there. So evolution, along with all of its other related origin stories, are not actually supported by the evidence, but are held to philosophically. The world had to make itself. Here's how. Here's our best answer as to how. And this is their best, still to this day, their best weapon against the church. And so they have a strong bias to hold to these things. And in place of the science, the university had to adopt scientism, which is one of the things we'll talk about in our 5th class, which is science as a pseudo-religion. To defend its origin stories, critical thought is discouraged, belief in authority is trumps data, and scientists who speak out are censored. I talk about all this in our Sunday school series on this that we covered 4 years ago. And just for sake of time, I won't go through all the things that atheists say about evolution, but it's kind of funny. Basically, what I want to convey to everybody here is if you engage in a conversation with an atheist, you will be discussing evolution at some point. You will not convince them until you shake their faith in evolution. If you cannot debate evolution intellectually, the atheist is going to steamroll you every time. And so you need to understand this. One of the things that I gave you as a supplemental, basically a homework assignment for you, is I gave you a list of books written on the topic if you want to get more interested in it. This is a book list of scientists, PhD scientists, who have a PhD in the field in which they are discussing, who got their PhD from an accredited university, and they are critical of evolution. They are critical of the different parts of this naturalistic worldview, and have a good 45, 50 books on that list, so you guys can search through that. This is biologists criticizing evolution. This is philosophers criticizing the philosophy of science they use to support evolution. This is engineers on intelligent design, chemists critical of abiogenesis, geologists who are critical on uniformitarian geology and support flood geology, physicists on radiometric dating, physicists and astronomers on the origin of the universe. And we also have a list of books written by multiple scientists. I didn't repeat any scientists, so that gives you a wide variety of people that you can look into. But this is so. Just to say, we need to be knowledgeable about evolution, and a lot of times we aren't. And I'd love to go into detail in more future classes, even more than we did in the past, to really go into the detail of the science stuff. What we're going to talk about today is pop atheist arguments, is popular level arguments. I would describe these as arguments that don't require any research or citation, that are easily spread, usually in the form of one-liners. They're like, mic drop moments, but are really just fundamentally fallacious. They don't mean anything. And what I want to do today, just as a show of good faith, is I want to talk about arguments that Christians should stop using. There's a great Bible verse that I like that says that it's time for judgment to start in the house of the Lord. Like, you want judgment to come? You first, Christians. Like, there's a great Bible verse that says that. But there are a lot of arguments that I think there are bad arguments on both sides. I think there are only good arguments on one side. And that's true of any debate. But there are a lot of arguments that I think that Christians should stop using. And apologetics is kind of an interesting topic in how you have a conversation with someone, specifically on training you how to have a conversation with someone you disagree with. Because how you have a debate, and I don't mean debate in a bad sense. A lot of people think bad things about debates. I just mean a debate as an exchange of ideas from people they disagree with. Is a lot of times it acts differently than a normal conversation would. If I walked up to you and I said, you're standing wrong, you'd be like, what do you mean I'm standing wrong? I can stand however I want to stand. What are you talking about? But if we're in a fencing class and I said, you're standing wrong, it's because you're in a confrontation, in a mock confrontation. And in order to be able to attack and defend, you need to be standing in a certain way. And the same intellectually is true. So a lot of times you have to critique how people argue certain things, because you may have even argued a true thing here, but it's not the time to argue this true thing. And so there's you could do a whole Sunday school series just on the details of how to talk to someone you disagree with. But I think there's a lot of arguments that Christians should stop using, popular level Christian arguments, before we get to the popular level atheist arguments. So one of these that I would put forward is what's known as Pascal's wager. So they'll say, well, if Christians are wrong, then when we die, we're not going to face any consequences. We're just going to die and there'll be nothing. But if atheists are wrong, they're going to go to hell. So you should default your position to Christianity, because if I'm wrong, you lose nothing. If you're wrong, you lose everything. Stop saying this. This is not a good argument. Now, why? Why do I say it's not a good argument? It might sound good. It might be a good one-liner. It's nice, easy to say in a conversation. Kind of hard to respond to. So why is it not a good argument? Well, the problems are, first of all, what if there's another religion that has a worse afterlife somehow? Like, let's say you and your family go to hell. Does that mean we should automatically believe in that? No, of course not. Okay, we shouldn't naturally default to another religion because they have a worse punishment after death. The statement has no evidence for the Christian faith and seems not to care which worldview is actually true. It's just talking about which one you're going to prefer based on what if it was true or what if it was false. But it has nothing to do with truth. It also neglects consequences in this life, because an atheist is going to say, well, I want to live this life now because it does have consequences, because this is the only life I know I'm going to have, and so I don't want to change how I'm living this life to affect a life that I may or may not have. And so it does have consequences from the atheist perspective, okay? One of the other arguments that Christians should stop using, I hear this a lot from Christians, I don't think it's a very good argument, is those, and it's good to critique how we engage in conversation with people and say, are we doing the best job that we can? They say, why do you atheists care so much? You can't hate a God that doesn't exist. The fact that you care so much proves that you believe God exists. Stop saying this. Okay, not a good argument. Now, why is this not a good argument? Well, atheists don't necessarily hate God. I think some of them do. They hate religion. And they do believe religion exists, so there's no inconsistency there. Atheists have been convinced that religion is the cause of all the world's problems. And therefore, advocating against religion would be an admirable thing to do. If religion is the cause of all problems, then arguing against religion would be a good thing. I think that slavery is wrong, so I become an abolitionist. I think that religion harms people, so I become an atheist. That makes sense from the atheist perspective. Dan Barker writes in his book, he was asked this question, if there is no God, why do you care? Why be obsessed with something that doesn't exist? In other words, why not shut up, is how he takes it. And he says, I am very concerned about our species' preoccupation with superstition and irrationality, and confident that if someone like me can be healed of such delusions, so can others. Okay, he's calling us deluded. He also says, I am not obsessed in a manic sense. I do have a life, and they are the ones who seem obsessed, not me. And I like to imagine the Spider-Man meme, if you guys have ever seen this, where Spider-Man's pointing at all the clones of Spider-Man, like who's obsessed? Are you obsessed? I'm obsessed. We're obsessed. You're obsessed. We're all obsessed over it. Just get over it. Okay, let's just have the conversation. We don't have to talk about who's more obsessed about it. But one of the other things that I think Christians should stop saying, a lot of Christians will say, well, I can't prove that there is a God, but you can't prove that there isn't a God. Stop saying that. That's not helpful. First of all, that's shifting the burden of proof. If I make an affirmative claim that there is a God, I should have some reason for believing that there is a God. And so usually the person who's arguing the affirmative is the one that has the burden of proof. Plus, there is proof for the existence of God from science, philosophy, history, etc., and so forth. So just give them the evidence. Like, why aren't we giving them the evidence? A lot of people just use this because they're not really familiar with fluent with the evidence for this, and that's what we're going to talk about in our second class, so we can be able to share it. There's a lot of things that Christians will say that critics of evolution, and you could live a triple-digit life and never meet anybody more anti-evolution than I am. But there are a lot of times that people criticize evolution, and will just criticize it in a wrong way. So they'll say evolution is just a theory. I don't believe in theories. I believe in facts. Stop saying that. Theories in science are explanations of data. The data is measurable, observable, and repeatable, and the theory explains the data and predicts new data. That's how we judge whether it's a good theory or not. I don't think it's a good theory, but it's not discounted just because it's a theory. And it's judged by its ability to explain and predict data, so we can actually verify theories. They'll say, well, if humans evolved from monkeys, then why are monkeys still here? And again, it's that kind of like mic drop moment, strut out like I own the place. But no, stop saying that. Okay, that's not a good argument against evolution. According to the evolution theory, modern-day humans and modern-day chimpanzees both have a common ancestor. So we didn't come from an chimp, we came from a chimp-like ancestor, which I don't think is better. I don't think makes any more sense. But we're misrepresenting the theory when we phrase it like this. Why is our ancestor still here? Well, according to the evolution theory, they're not. But it also, and evolutionists never point this out. I don't know why evolutionists never point this out. I don't know if they know their theory as well as they think they do. But the evolution theory also allows for creatures to be both transitional forms and to still exist. Okay? So the coelacanth is one of them. The coelacanth is a fish that has a fin that kind of looks like an arm, and they say this is the in-between stage for land and for water and land. And they use this as a missing link for a while. The coelacanth was then discovered as still being around. Okay, they used to use it as an index fossil, which said it was only in this layer, was never in any other layer. They were proven wrong because it was found still swimming in the ocean. But they'll still use it as a transitional fossil, even though it still exists. And you'll say, well, how can you still use it as a transitional fossil if it still exists? They'll say, well, half of the coelacanths evolved into human beings, and the other half stayed fish. And you're like, well, why did half of them change and half of them didn't? And they're like, oh, just because they moved to different environments or something. It's almost like the theory of evolution has such plasticity, can change so much that it can explain anything, and therefore meaningfully explains nothing. Okay, but we can save that criticism for another time. And you'll ask them, why do the coelacanth fossils look the exact same as they look today? And it's like, well, because they were perfectly adapted to their environment, so they never had to change. Like, well, if they were perfectly adapted to their environment, then why did they change in us? It's like, there's a lot of things that don't add up there, but just saying that if humans evolved from monkeys, why are monkeys still here? That's not a good criticism. And the last thing that we'll have as Christians that we shouldn't say, but this also applies to atheists, so this is a good transition form here, is Christians will say that faith is belief without evidence. And atheists will say faith is belief without evidence. Both of us, Christians and atheists, need to stop saying that. Faith is not belief without evidence, okay? J. Warner Wallace points this out, and he says, faith is actually the opposite of unbelief. It's not the opposite of reason. And you can see how atheists respond to this. They'll say faith is not a virtue. Faith is gullibility. It's dishonesty. Faith is blindness. Faith is the absence of reason. Faith should not be respected. It should be detested. And if you define faith as just randomly believing things with no evidence, then I would actually agree. You shouldn't blindly believe stuff with no evidence. Of course, I have evidence to believe that there's a God. I have evidence to believe that Jesus is God. We talked about that last year in our Who is Jesus series. We'll talk a little bit about that more next week. But Christopher Hitchens says, if one must have faith into believing in something, then the likelihood of something having any truth value in it is considerably diminished. The harder work of inquiry, proof, and demonstration is infinitely more rewarding and has confronted us with findings more miraculous and transcendent than any theology. Dan Barker says, faith and reason began a war in me. He said the only proposed answer was faith, and I gradually grew to dislike the smell of that word. I finally realized that faith is a cop-out. If the only way you can accept an assertion is by faith, then you're admitting that the assertion can't be taken by its own merits. Okay, and I think that theism and Christianity have plenty of evidence to them. I don't need to argue that there is no evidence, you just blindly need to believe it. Now, a lot of people get confused about this because a lot of people have what I like to call the doubting Thomas fallacy. They'll hear the story of doubting Thomas, and they'll say, see, this is proof without belief because Jesus says, blessed are they that have not seen and yet believe. What we forget about this is Jesus actually presented him the evidence that he was looking for. Thomas said, I will not believe until I see the print in his hands, print of his nails. Now, Thomas had every reason to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. He knew Jesus for a long time. He saw the miracles that Jesus did. He had the reliable eyewitness testimony from the people that he knew. He knew the Old Testament prophecies that Jesus was going to fulfill. He had all the evidence there. Okay, so he could conclude, just like we can conclude today, that Jesus really is who he says he is. But he says, I need to see it. So Jesus comes to him and says, hey, look at this. Isn't that cool? And he shows himself to Thomas. And he says, here's the evidence you were asking for. Now have faith. Faith isn't against the evidence. Faith is with the evidence. He says, be not faithless, but believing. And then he says, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet believe. We don't have to have a physical experience with Jesus to see him. We have all the evidence we already need from the eyewitness testimony, from the prophecy in the Old Testament. We have all this information. We already have that. And a lot of Christians, I think, say this stuff about faith because when they became a Christian, they didn't know the presuppositional argument from logic as a support for the existence of God. They're like, what is that? They're not familiar with this, and so they get squirrely when you start talking about the evidence because they're like, Christianity to me isn't an academic study, and it's like it's not an academic study. When you become a Christian because you accept salvation. But salvation, the gift of salvation, the gospel message, I think itself is extremely evidence-based. Is you start by saying that we're imperfect. Okay, there is no more supported statement in all of human history than to say that we're imperfect. I believe that more than I believe in gravity. Like, of course we're imperfect. There's never been a more supported statement than that. To believe that our imperfect actions deserve a penalty to them, that's just basic moral intuition. That's plenty evidence-based. I may not be familiar with the historical documentation of Jesus, but at least I can understand that if God came down and sacrificed himself, an all just God would have to punish that, but an all loving God would say, "Hey, I'll take that punishment for you," and that just kind of makes intuitive sense. And the conclusion is, believe in the Lord Jesus and you shall be saved. And it's like, well, why wouldn't I? That's a completely evidence-based case. And I like to say that the point of apologetics and how it relates to evidence is very much like taking medicine. Let's say you're ill and I have a pill that can cure your illness. Now, I can give you the evidence that taking the medication will cure your illness. I can give you the double-blind, peer-reviewed studies to show that it's going to work. But knowing the evidence of the medication, believing the accuracy of the studies, is not what's going to cure your illness. What's going to cure your illness? Taking the medication. But knowing the evidence for the medication might make you more likely to take the medication. And so this is the skeptic who wants to know the details. It's like, well, we have the details. We can give them to you. Many people don't look at the evidence before they take the medication. That's true. They're still cured. Okay? You're not saved because you didn't know every single detail about apologetics. You're still saved because you accepted Jesus. You took the medication. But others didn't look at the evidence either, and they took the wrong medication and took the wrong religion, took the wrong way to heaven, which there's only one, so everything else is going to end up in destruction. And so that's the reason why it's important to look at the evidence. But now that we've criticized Christians a little bit, let's start criticizing the atheists a little bit and talk about atheist arguments that they should stop using. They'll say, you only believe in God because of where you were born and what your parents' religion was, and if you were born in Iraq, you would be a Muslim. Stop saying that. Atheists need to stop saying that. Atheists say that a lot. Richard Dawkins says, if you are religious, and it is overwhelming probably that your religion is that of your parents. If you were born in Arkansas, you think that Christianity is true and Islam is false, knowing full well that you would think the opposite if you had been born in Afghanistan. You are a victim of childhood indoctrination. Dan Barker talks about how we believe what our parents told us, because when we're children, we just believe everything our parents tell us, and so they'll tell you, don't stick your hand in fire. Why? Just because. Okay, just because. I won't. And believe in a God. Oh, why not? Just believe it. Oh, okay, I will. And they'll say, you just believed it because you were a kid, and when you're a kid, you have to believe everything your parents tell you because you're a kid and you don't know any better. And he says that's where religion comes from. He makes his argument in his book. Now, this commits a logical fallacy known as the genetic fallacy. It's also known as appeal to origin. Where the idea came from has nothing to do with whether it's right or not. The idea is true or false independent of where it came from, and this is why the genetic fallacy exists. As people get older, they tend to examine what they were taught as if it was true, to see if it was true. When you were probably told stuff that was wrong when you were a kid, and you got older and you realized, hey, that was wrong, I need to change my mind. And people do that all the time. People change their minds all the time. Christians to atheists and atheists to Christians, they change their minds all the time. The idea that you just believe in something because of where you were born, that's a silly argument. They'll say, well, if you were choking, would you want me to pray or perform CPR? Because if you say that you want me to perform CPR, that means you're saying the prayer doesn't work. Atheists need to stop saying that. I hear that a lot. Carl Sagan says this a lot. He says, we pray over a cholera victim, or we can give her 50 milligrams of this medication every 12 hours. He says, if you want to save your child from polio, you can pray or you can inoculate. This commits a logical fallacy known as a false dichotomy. There's no reason you can't do both. There's no reason that both can't be true or both can't be false. Like they're just saying you have to do this or this is a false dichotomy. There's no reason you can't do both. And also, the Bible talks specifically against that. The Bible criticizes in James chapter 2, it criticizes people who pray for someone but don't actually help them. So this is not a Christian way of thinking at all. Some atheists will say, oh, well, we're all born atheists until we're indoctrinated into our faith. Atheists need to stop saying that. Okay, here's a meme that says, there is no God in this newborn's brain. It's an atheist until it is infected with lies. They'll say, proof that God is a taught concept. We are not born with the knowledge of his existence. We are taught it. Okay, the problem is that this uses the definition of atheism, which is a lack of belief, which is a strange way of saying it because it's not actually talking about what the real truth is. It's talking about how you view it. It's a kind of a weird way of describing it, but if we describe it that way, then a rock is an atheist. A rock lacks belief in the existence of God. A baby is also born naked and illiterate. But I would suggest that you put some pants on, read some books, and follow the evidence where it leads, okay? Just because you didn't believe it as a baby doesn't mean you can't believe it now. Of course, most people are built with kind of an intuitive knowledge that there exists a God, but obviously a baby can't formulate that. So it's just a weird, bizarre argument that they need to stop using. An atheist will say, I hear this one a lot, you're an atheist too. You don't believe in any of the other 1,000 gods from the other religions. I just doubt one more God than you do. Ricky Gervais says there have been nearly 3,000 gods so far, but only yours actually exists. The others are silly, made-up nonsense, but yours is real. Sam Harris talks about this, about how it's obvious that the Muslims are fooling themselves. It's obvious to you. It's obvious that anyone who thinks that the Quran is perfect word of the creator of the universe has not read the book carefully. Isn't it obvious that the doctrine of Islam represents a near-perfect barrier to honest inquiry? Yes, these things are obvious to you. Understand the way you view Islam is precisely the way that devout Muslims view Christianity, and is the way that I view all religions. Richard Dawkins says, I have found it amusing strategy when asked whether I'm an atheist to point out that the questioner is also an atheist when considering Zeus, Apollo, Amun-Ra, Mithras, Baal, Thor, Wutan, the golden calf, and the flying spaghetti monster. I just go one god further. Now, it's a silly argument. Let me try to explain why. I am a bachelor. I am not married, okay? Imagine I walk up to Pastor Jimmy and I say, you're a bachelor too. And he says, I'm not a bachelor, I'm married. And I say, yeah, well, are you married to that girl? He says, no. I say, well, are you married to that girl? He says, no. Are you married to that girl? He says, no. And I say, so there are 3 billion women on the planet, and you deny being married to all of them except one. So you're just as much of a bachelor as me. I just go one woman further. It's a ridiculous argument. The fact that he is married to one woman is what makes him not a bachelor. The fact that I believe in a God is what makes me not an atheist, okay? And so it's a ridiculous thing on the surface. But this also assumes that all religions have the same types of claims and have the same types of evidence behind them. I'll support Christianity, you support Islam. Go. Like, if you believe Islam is just as supported as I believe Christianity is, then the burden of proof is on you to prove Islam to me. But the atheist, of course, doesn't believe that. Okay? They just think that all religions have no evidence. All religions don't even make the same kinds of claims. Okay? Like, I can claim that Jesus died on the cross. Like, that's a historical claim. I don't know how you would prove reincarnation. I don't even know what that would entail. It's not even the same type of claims. What they'll also say is that all religions contradict each other, therefore they all must be false. And that's actually a false argument. They'll say, since it is inconceivable that all religions can be right, the most reasonable conclusion is that they are all wrong. That's Christopher Hitchens. Richard Dawkins says the same thing. This is a false use of the law of non-contradiction. If you have two things that are contradictory, or a million things that are contradictory, it's at most one of them can be true. So either none of them are true or one of them's true. Well, I believe one of them's true. So we haven't ruled out my position yet. I believe that Christianity is true. And so it's a misuse of the law of non-contradiction. They'll say, I would believe in a God if he appeared to me or did a miracle. This is a false argument, because what it's doing is it's creating a false standard of evidence. If I said, I don't believe that billionaires exist, and you said, Jonathan, obviously billionaires exist, and you show me bank records, you show me news reports of people winning, $1 billion, you show me people making $1 billion, this person crossed the $1 billion mark, you show me news articles of that, I don't believe that they're all lies. You show me their bank records, okay, I don't believe that the bank's in cahoots with them, okay? And so you're like, well, what evidence would convince you? And I say, well, if Bill Gates bought me a house, then I would believe that billionaires exist. It's like, that's creating a new false standard of evidence. I have plenty of evidence already, okay, to believe that billionaires exist. I don't need Bill Gates to buy my house, okay? And so we have all the evidence. We're going to talk about that next week. We have all the evidence for the existence of God. We don't need any more individual appearances. They'll say that if they saw God appear to them, they would believe it. If they saw the heavens part, and God came down and they saw it and said, you need to become a Christian, then they would believe. And I think it was William Lane Craig who answered back and said, wouldn't you think that you just were seeing a delusion? And the atheist says, well, yeah, probably. I'm like, well, then you wouldn't accept, But one of the other things they'll say is that people interpret the Bible differently. Everyone interprets the Bible differently, so the Bible can say anything that you want it to. Atheists need to stop saying that. It's a ridiculous thing for atheists to say. And atheists, I'll just flip through this because we're running out of time, but atheists say a lot of this constantly all the time. The Bible doesn't say anything because anyone could take it to mean anything they want it to mean. Okay? If I read Adolf Hitler's book and I come to the conclusion that Adolf Hitler loved the Jews, okay, and you said, Jonathan, I think you misread that. And I say, well, that's my interpretation. And I can interpret it any way I want to. That's not how you read a book. Like, a book is, people have an idea, they convey their idea using language in written form, we can read it. Like, this is basic stuff. You can't just interpret anything to be anything you want. If I told you that in order to get to heaven, the Bible says that you need to put on a chicken suit and do a chicken dance in front of a chicken restaurant, and that's how you get to heaven. And you say, well, Jonathan, that's not in the Bible. I say, yes, it is in the Bible. And you say, where is that in the Bible? I say, you see John 1:1 that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God? You say, yeah. And I say, see the next verse, it says, in the beginning, or it says that the Word was the same as God. You say, yeah. And I say, well, in between the verses, it says that you need to do a chicken suit and a chicken dance in front of a chicken restaurant to get to heaven. And you're like, Jonathan, it doesn't say that. And I'm like, well, I'm reading the gaps in between the verses, okay? And I say this, I make joke of that because that's literally the argument for the gap theory in Genesis, is that evolution fits in there, it's just between the gaps of verse 1 and verse 2. I'm like, that's not how you read a text, okay? It's obvious when people are twisting the text to fit with what they want it to believe. And it should be obvious, this is not a real criticism, okay? We can read the text and see what it says. And of course, people twist the Bible to say anything they want it to say. I think that's tacit evidence that they think that the Bible is the Word of God. Because everyone wants the Word of God to agree with them. They don't want to agree with the Word of God. And there's a subtle difference there. But they want to make the Bible fit with whatever they say. Except for atheists, they want to make it say the opposite. These are some of the things that these kind of pop things that atheists say, popular level things that Christians and atheists say that we need to get through. And then we're going to cover, next week, we're going to cover the evidences for God. The central question, the central debate between theists and atheists is there evidence for the existence of God? And I think there's plenty of evidence for the existence of God, and we're going to talk about that next week. But does anyone have any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns?